Although the Wars of the Roses was a turbulent time, it should not be imagined that England wasn't making progress along the lines of Alfred the Great's original vision, requiring men of war to guard what had already been built, men of work to see to the present needs of the nation, and men of prayer to think about the future. And the cultural and administrative progress that had been made in the 13th and 14th centuries was enhanced enormously when Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453 and the learning of the East moved westwards into Europe. In Britain it was the monasteries that were the centres of education, and King Alfred had already laid the foundations for Oxford University when he endowed a monastery at Oxford in the latter half of the 9th century. And by the end of the 11th century, University College Oxford had come into existence specifically to cater for the needs of the Church, to educate its future clerics. It was followed soon after by Balliol College in 1263 and Merton College the year after, the first of many colleges to become an Oxford University with a worldwide reputation. An early alumni of Merton College was the founder of Lollardry, John Wycliffe. Developments in the arts and sciences would soon begin to blossom in these new colleges as well. But expansion of the new learning was not only happening in Britain, it was taking place all over Europe. Exchanges of ideas, students and scholars between all the centres of learning springing up in Europe was happening in earnest amongst those with inquiring minds, and the fall of Constantinople would expand the academic disciplines available to all of them. But there has often been conflict between towns and gowns, and when in 1209 a student at Oxford accidentally caused the death of a woman of the town, he panicked and fled. His 3 roommates were then accused of murder and hanged, and a majority of the rest of the students needed little persuasion from the townspeople to quit the town. They decided to come here, to Cambridge, and set up their own university. And from those humble beginnings came these wonderful buildings and colleges that we have here now. This particular quadrangle belongs to Pembroke College, set up in 1347. Education was very close to the heart of Henry I, Henry III, and Henry VI, all supposedly weak kings. This is Peterhouse College, the oldest of the Cambridge University colleges, founded in 1284 by the Bishop of Ely. And this is Queen's College, founded by Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife, in 1446. Achieving an appropriate allocation of resources between men of war and men of prayer has been a challenge beleaguering governments from time immemorial. Behind me now is King's College Chapel, founded in 1441 by Henry VI. But it would take 100 years for the college and the chapel to be finished. Edward IV didn't continue the work. Richard III did. But it was left to Henry VII and Henry VIII to complete it. It shows just how much we owe to the nobility of those centuries for the educational establishments that we can all now enjoy. The music we're listening to was composed by a John of Dunstable, who lived in the first half of the 15th century. And one of the scholars who came to Cambridge was Desiderius Erasmus, who came from Rotterdam in Holland, a man who became a hub in the dissemination and spread of the new thinking. With 2 universities in England and 3 in Scotland, all established before the end of the 15th century, Great Britain was at the forefront of the new learning, and the foundations were being laid for prosperity on an unprecedented scale in the centuries soon to come. These new keys to learning had been largely facilitated by a man called Johannes Gutenberg, a Dutchman who'd invented a new way of printing, making books far more available, including the Gutenberg Bible, published in 1535 from William Tyndale's translation, completed by Miles Coverdale. Tyndale would be burnt at the stake by the Roman Catholic Church in 1536 for the heresy committed simply by translating it. the Church would fight tooth and nail to prevent the vision shared by King Alfred, John Wycliffe, and William Tyndale of God's Word being translated into the vernacular so that ordinary people could read it. The new learning was creating tensions amongst the clerics. And so it was approaching the turn of the 15th century. England was a country in chaos and turmoil, needing to be sorted out. The Wars of the Roses weren't over yet. After defeating the Lancastrian army at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Edward IV consolidated his position on the throne ruthlessly by executing any of the Lancastrian support amongst the nobility who hadn't been killed in the battle. He then set up the rudiments of a secret service still in existence today to alert him about any potential treasonable activity. But having done that, he largely set aside the legacy of parliamentary principle adhered to and applied by his father, Richard of York, who died at the Battle of Wakefield, and ignored or corrupted the possibilities of the emerging parliamentary system. His younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, watched these developments with some concern. Public discontent had been growing throughout Edward's reign, and at his death England once again faced the turmoil of its new young king not yet being old enough to rule. So when the Duke of Gloucester was appointed as protector of the realm, he immediately called a parliament to address these concerns. The practice whereby the king could extort money by benevolences, raising funds against the future authorizations of Parliament, was declared illegal. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, proved himself a very popular protector of the freedoms which the people of England were beginning to understand and enjoy. I've come to Ludlow, where the focus of the story now turns, because when Edward IV died suddenly in April 1483, this is where his two sons, Edward and Arthur, were staying, here at Ludlow Castle. The new protector, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was their uncle. Edward was only 13, and his younger brother was 10. This view of the river from the castle walls is virtually unchanged from those days. Parliament had been called for June, 2 months after Edward IV's death. The new young king, Edward V, expressed a desire to go straight to London and be crowned, but the petition accepted by Parliament was that the boy's succession should be set aside and the crown taken by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who amidst great pomp and ceremony was then crowned king. This is St. Lawrence's Church in Ludlow, and behind me is the window showing the two princes, Edward and Arthur. And when those two princes were committed to the Tower of London, and then disappeared, support for Richard III began to fade away. Whether this notorious murder of the princes in the Tower was instigated directly by Richard III, his sometime henchman the Duke of Buckingham, or Henry Tudor, has never been properly established, but two skeletons were found in 1674 underneath a staircase in the Tower of London, which fitted the descriptions and the ages of the boys. And rightly or wrongly, Richard III has been held responsible ever since. By the end of 1483, the Duke of Buckingham had been executed for treason, and it had been made clear to Henry Tudor, who had escaped from Wales to France, that he would be welcome in many parts of England and Wales as a replacement for the Yorkist king. Henry Tudor was descended via a rather tortuous genealogy from Edward III via John of Gaunt on the Lancastrian side, and so the Wars of the Roses were set to continue. On the 8th of August 1485, Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven with a small force of soldiers. He then marched up the difficult terrain round the coast to avoid alerting Richard as to his presence, and met up with another friendly force collected by Rhys ap Thomas in mid-Wales, by which time the king in Nottingham had been told that Henry had landed. Henry continued his progress eastwards, all the time gathering more forces, and he was welcomed here at Shrewsbury, one of several towns that was changing its allegiance to the Lancastrian cause. He crossed the Welsh bridge over the River Severn Now he was in England. There was no turning back. But Henry had a problem. He'd been expected for nearly 2 years, and Richard had a standing army ready to greet him, of over 10,000 men. Henry's forces numbered less than half that. Nevertheless, he continued his way eastwards to confront the king, gathering more forces as he went. Meanwhile, Richard in Nottingham sent to the Duke of Norfolk, the Earl of Northumberland, and the Earl of Surrey to augment his force to a number which he felt would be both adequate and reliable. But amongst the support that Richard was counting on was that of Lord Stanley, one of a generous number of sometime Lancastrian supporters, who Richard had spared and pardoned only 2 years earlier for supporting his enemies, and who was now married to Henry Tudor's mother. But wherever Richard's support came from, confrontation and bloodshed were inevitable. Richard took his forces south from Nottingham to a battleground of his choosing and camped at Ambion Hill between Sutton Cheney and Dadlington. Richard is remembered at this church in Sutton Cheney, where he spent the night before the battle. This is the top of Ambion Hill, where it was originally thought that the battle took place. But although Richard's forces may have been camped here, recent researches indicate that the battle actually took place over in the fields of Reedmoor, where significant evidence was found near Fen Lane and the brook, where at the end of the battle the crown was allegedly found hanging on a bush beside the stream. And this is the ditch and the stream which crosses Fen Lane. The story of the battle from contemporary records is easily told. With no experience of the battlefield, Henry Tudor stayed with a small force to protect him behind his main army. The king's right flank, led by the Duke of Norfolk, charged first. But in the fierce hand-to-hand fighting that followed, in an effort to rally his troops who were giving ground, the Duke of Norfolk was himself killed. Richard gave orders to the Duke of Northumberland to charge, but the Duke of Northumberland wavered and then declined. Whereupon King Richard himself, seeing Henry Tudor in an unprotected group on the flank of the main battleground, drew his own sword and with only a few to protect him personally, charged towards Henry Tudor himself. Literally yards away from his objective, Richard saw that his supposed ally Lord Stanley had no intention of moving in to support him, and with cries of treason, 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 Richard was himself cut down, and his crown, found lodged in the hedge, was presented to Henry Tudor. Richard's body was taken and buried in the grounds of a monastery near Leicester, to be found underneath a car park. In 2012, Richard of York would be the last King of England to die on the field of battle. In a successful reconciliation of the two sides of the same feuding family, Henry VII combined the red and the white roses to form a new Tudor rose that is still in the coat of arms of the United Kingdom today, and married Elizabeth of York. And so in the days and weeks following the battle, the people of the surrounding villages were left to bury the Welshmen and Englishmen who had fought and died on both sides in what would be the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. It was a turning point. England had had enough of this form of decision-making.